So we're now speaking to Professor Lawrence Zhang, Assistant Professor at the Division of Humanities at the Hong Kong University of Science and Technology. His research focuses on late imperial and modern Chinese history, and in particular, the history of tea in East Asia. Today, we're discussing his paper, Teaching Farmers How to Farm, Skills and Knowledge in Taiwan's Tea Industry in the 20th Century, where he traces the government policies of incentivizing and educating small farmers to produce quality tea. So thank you for being with us today. I have to say that it's a really, really informational and interesting paper. I personally learned a lot about the tea industry in general. So I guess I'm going to start off with a very general question. So what is the central question that you seek to address in the paper, and what is your answer to it?
So I started the research actually looking into this, wanting to sort of understand how Taiwan navigated the trials and tribulations of East Asian tea producers in the 20th century because of the pressures from South Asia and Java and places like that. And one of the things that I came across is that there was a lot of talk about making better tea, especially in Taiwan. And this is sort of in contrast with China, where they're more concerned about things like cost. And with the recent publication of the book by Andrew Liu called Tea War, I think he sort of uses that as his lens, right? He talks about cost and the sort of oppressive labor practices and early capitalism in Asia. And I sort of want to push back a little bit on that, because one of the things I noticed is that in Taiwan itself, anyway, they don't really talk about costs nearly as much as you would imagine they do. Rather, they're always talking about quality, quality, quality. How do we make better tea? How can we make this better? How can we make it more consistent? And so it's not just about raising quality, but it's about raising the average quality and especially eliminating the lower end, which is kind of what happens. Which if you have too much of it, is what happens to your tea prices for the Chinese side of the market. China tea's market prices crashed because there was too much fake or poorly produced tea, and people just decided they don't want to buy it. So eliminating bad practices was a big theme. And so in that sense, that's an aspect of the changes in the tea industry that happened in 20th century that I don't see that is discussed very often in the literature. So that's sort of what this paper is coming from.
Yeah, I think that helps contextualize the paper even a bit further, because I did pick up one of the central arguments that you highlight really nicely in the paper is the overt emphasis on improving the quality rather than lowering the production cost. And I'm quite interested in this whole emphasis on quality, but coming from a total different intellectual kind of trajectory. And you frame this emphasis on quality as a logical choice, which makes a lot of sense in your writing. But I'm wondering if there's anything more to the quality discourse, like the politics of quality and the cultural significance, because essentially it's about, like winning the market share on the global market, competing against other producers or countries of tea production, and somewhere you mentioned the reputation and the branding of Taiwan tea. So I wonder if that has something to do with ties into the whole emphasis of quality.
Yeah, I actually struggle with that too, because it's such a sort of nebulous concept, right? Quality, what does this actually mean? I think I suspect one thing that's going on is that there is not a lot they can do about cost, because Taiwan didn't have as much free labor as maybe mainland China did. You can't just randomly hire a whole bunch of people to do whatever you need to do. And mechanization, which they were encouraging, was also done in the name of quality, because mechanization at that time didn't necessarily make things cheaper. Getting that machinery up into the mountain, getting everything set up, having the right fuel to run it. It's not that cheap in, say, 1920s or 1930s Taiwan. But what it does is it makes the product more consistent, right? Instead of some guy rolling the tea with his hand for hours and hours and then getting tired. So by the end of the night, when he's still doing it, the tea is coming out worse and worse. The machine doesn't have those problems. So I think part of it might actually be that they just can't do that much about cost, and they can't collectivize farms, and they can't do any of those things. So quality becomes sort of the only variable that they can really control. I suspect that's one of them. The other thing is, I think they sort of position themselves slightly differently in the market. Oolong tea that Taiwan mostly sold it was a relatively, and still is actually, a relatively higher skilled product in the sort of tea market. And so, in that sense, I think there's a lot more room to improve the quality than, say, a black tea. And supposedly, anyway, if you believe the reports that they were writing at the time, the market sort of positioning of oolong, of Taiwanese oolong, has always been a bit higher than say teas from mainland China. And one of the things they prohibited, for example, I don't think I mentioned this in the paper, was the adulteration of Taiwanese tea with tea imported from the mainland, from mainland China, and then pretending to be Taiwanese tea and then resold overseas. So they wanted to make sure that what was sold was tea produced in Taiwan that's of a higher standard than what was being produced elsewhere. And because of that, and I think they put a lot of emphasis on making better tea. Yeah.
I think that's very interesting, and because I do my research mainly on the contemporary period of time, and then I noticed that in Taiwan there is a very strong emphasis on quality and Taiwan brand and the local thing. I'm just presuming that there is a sort of a legacy as early, at least as early as this period with tea industry, with the emphasis on quality.
Quite possibly, yeah. Might also have to do with the smaller size, where things are a little easier to control, and it's a little easier to keep track of who everyone is, and so also to hold people more accountable, right? There are only so many places you can export the tea. There are only so many places that were producing tea. Everyone sort of knows everyone. It's a relatively speaking small ecosystem. So I think that also makes it probably a little easier to try to work on that side of the equation.
It makes a lot of sense to think about it in a sort of a social, economic, and material perspective. And that's actually one of the things I really enjoy in your paper, because this kind of materiality of tea, especially oolong tea, it requires totally different technical processes and techniques as well. And also when we're talking about the quality, and I'm coming from the tradition of studying contemporary mainland China, we have this whole discourse of quality and approaching it predominantly from a symbolic perspective. And whereas in this case, there's a lot of material, practical considerations that push people to go into this trajectory as the only option to improve the tea industry market share on the global market. So I wonder, I mean, probably it's just more of a comment and observations that the whole materiality of tea and sort of lies underneath the whole policies that the government could pick up.
Yeah, I mean, the tea is a little bit special, right? I think I make this point in the paper. It's a lot of studies of commodities, agricultural commodities, tend to think of it as mostly interchangeable goods that, where there's terroir and other those kinds of concerns, but that's usually for more luxury goods like wine and stuff. And tea is often lumped in with the sort of more basic stuff, where like sugar, the classic study example, right? Sidney Mintz and his study of sugar. And sugar, as long as it's sweet and it does what it's supposed to do, we consumers don't really spend that much time thinking about it, right? But tea is different in the sense that you have to make it right within about 24 hours of harvest. And if you screw up the initial processing within the first day or so of harvesting, especially for oolong tea, but black tea or green tea, the same applies. If you screw it up between the picking of the leaves and the frying of the tea, it's over. Like you can try to save it, and there are ways to sort of fix screwed up tea, but it's not going to be the same, and the result is not going to be the same. And because of limitations of transportation, limitation of the infrastructure, and all those things, that at least up until the mid to late 20th century, that had to be done on the farm. Which means that the farmers who were doing the plucking had also to be able to process it properly in order to achieve as much value as they can out of the leaves. And the skills involved are not really trivial, at least for oolong tea. It's quite complicated. There are lots of steps, and there are lots of things where bad things can happen. And it also depends on things like weather. So being able to manage all those factors and to mitigate the problems that comes along the way is very important, and you need to educate people to do that. And one of the things they tried to do was to educate farmers to how to do better, and also to give them resources to how to do better. And one of the things I talked about in the paper is how, and you still hear the same discourse today, which is the farmers say these quote unquote experts don't know what they're doing. They are these people from the research stations. They have no idea what they're talking about. They don't even know how to make tea properly. Only we do. And then the research station people are also like, well, they're not really up to date. These farmers are not up to date on the best practices. Like they don't experiment. They don't know. We are the ones who hold this knowledge, and there is that tension there between those two sides. But when they're working together and when they're working well together, and I think for Taiwan, they mostly did, it can create some good products and they can work out. Whereas in China, there was always that, it's sort of a comparison case, right? It's mainland China. There was always that disconnect between what the government wants to do and what they were able to achieve and what the farmers were able to do. And owing to war and civil war and all kinds of stuff, that never happened at least until the communist period. So the trajectory for the two industries were very different.
That's very fascinating. Yeah, that's very fascinating. I just sort of look forward to the comparative study on this same issue and to see the differences from a comparative perspective. And I think we just talked about a lot of very interesting aspects of some of the details of the paper. What we were just discussing is about the small farmers, and what is very eye-opening for me to know is that tea farmers have to do more than just farming, and this making of malcha, the initial processing of tea, is very part and parcel of the whole farming business for small farmers. And another thing I picked up, is hinted at, you mentioned it in the paper as well, is that the way I read it is that the small farmers sort of have some kind of initiatives to decide to not do tea farming, and they can leave if the production or the return of investment wasn't good enough. And there is this very interesting tension between the state and the farmers, state citizen sort of relations, is that the state not only have to educate them how to make proper tea, but also try to keep them in the business, in the sense that they really needed the farmers to make the tea, to farm the tea, to produce the tea in order to have the quality tea to sell on the market.
Yeah, it was almost 100% export in Taiwan, right? So tea was a valuable source of export revenue. And yeah, if you make it too difficult for farmers to sell the tea, guess what? They'd just be like, okay, fine, we don't want to bother. And so, yeah, you can't make it too hard either. And so you really want to push them to do it. And this happened, I think, see, this is a part of the story that I am not so clear on because of COVID. I haven't been able to go back to Taiwan. But I think this happened after the mid 70s when Taiwan got kicked out of most world organizations and export market kind of dried up a bit. A lot of farmers gave up their tea farms or interspersed their tea plants with betel nuts and things like that in order to make more money because tea export wasn't doing very well. Or at least that's the story I've heard from farmers when I talk to them. So yeah, there were alternatives. And so keeping them there was also important. And yeah, it's this interesting sort of balancing act. That's not always very easy to manage. And the same tension was happening in China as well. Very similar kinds of tension. A lot of farmers they didn't depend on the tea for their day-to-day livelihood. It was a nice extra source of income, but
yeah. That's really wonderful. I just wondered to what extent, if we put these two cases in an even larger comparative perspective, if, for example, thinking about sugar and then the role of small farmers and if the story is told from their perspective, it's very different, precisely because of their relative independence from these whole business on tea, on this particular commodity.
Yeah, I've tried making this point elsewhere in another paper that this is sort of one of the earlier cases. I don't know which one is the earliest. One of the earlier cases where you have small holding farmers going up against agricultural conglomerates, right? Big agribusiness. Tea plantations was one of the probably earliest ones that are vertically integrated. People who were selling the tea at the end were also owning tea plantations. And they practice exploitative labor practices and things like that. And so on the one hand, you have those, and then on the other hand, you have these small holding farmers, especially in places like Taiwan, that were trying to figure out how to compete with these people, and it's tough. And so it makes sense to go the quality route rather than competing on cost, because you can't beat them on cost. But it was not just cost, because South Asian tea, for example, was actually achieving better prices in the major markets than say teas from China. So they were actually seen as better quality, and at the same time they had lower cost. So how do you do that? It's rough. Yeah, and
yeah.
So that's kind of their story. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's why this paper is so wonderful, because it's always very informational. It provides a lot of rich details, and at the same time tells a very interesting story with fascinating points for me, knowledge points for me to enjoy. And also it opens up a whole new scope of questions if we try to put it into a comparative perspective.